Hello, this is Pastor Jack with the second session of our Bible study, Apocalyptic and Pandemic. We are launching into a study of some apocalyptic literature, particularly the book of Revelation, and doing it from the background and context of the world in which apocalyptic literature thrived. That may not be all that different than the world in which we find ourselves in the coronavirus pandemic. And so I'd like to begin with some background of apocalyptic prophecy. Way back in 538 BC, the Persian king named Cyrus issued an edict that all captive people would be freed. It was a very smart political move, and this edict was translated into many languages, including Hebrew, and the Hebrew version of that edict adapted Cyrus' edict to say that God actually spoke to Cyrus and told him to send all the people back home to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. Copies of that edict in the Hebrew version are in the Bible. The book of Ezra and Nehemiah, which is originally was one scroll, Ezra and Nehemiah, and it was a sequel to Chronicles that we have as First and Second Chronicles, probably the same author for both sets of writings. The high priest going back was Ezra, and the governor was Nehemiah for all those returning to Jerusalem. This was a time of Isaiah and Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, those prophets, and particularly the prophets Haggai and Zechariah provided more accurate information. It was not necessarily historically accurate, but it's the only history we have of the post-exilic period. And so a group of exiles returned to Jerusalem in 538 BC. It represented about 10% of all the Jews in exile who had gone to exile in Babylon. About 10% returned at first. They had high hopes for what they would find. They were inspired by the writings of that portion of Isaiah's scroll that we call Second Isaiah, starting with about chapter 40, going through about chapter 55 or 60, somewhere in there. And they got to Jerusalem, and it was devastating. There was a pile of rubble they found. No rebuilding had gone on during the exile, and they were not alone. They were not welcomed by the people that were there in Judah. The description were that the exiles brought a lot of supplies back for the temple. These were described in the writings. The worship by sacrifice was begun right away. The groundwork was laid for a new temple. In 520 is when the groundwork was laid. Reference to that was also in the prophets Haggai and Zechariah. And the basic, very humble temple was completed about 516 to 515. The big issue in Ezra's mind was racial purity and the problems with intermarriage. The books of Ruth and of Jonah were written probably about this same time, though they were set much earlier in Jewish history. And they were written to emphasize the positive role that foreigners played in Jewish life. The voices of the prophets Haggai and Zechariah and Malachi were less effective. They had no threats left for the people. The prophets had no way to threaten them because what are they going to do? Send them back into exile? The portion of Isaiah called Third Isaiah, the last 10 chapters or so, maybe 56 to 65 or 6, something like that, describes the disappointment of the people and the way that the people began to have doubts about God's power. King Zerubbabel of Judah, he was actually a descendant of David, but had been appointed by the Persian leaders. And then the high priest of Judah, Joshua, these were in power now, and they had hopes for a new temple. And that when they built the new temple, they believed that Yahweh would return. But it didn't work out that way. We read in Zechariah 9:9 and following that the prophets cast visions of hope, but the people became skeptical. And the faith in Yahweh gradually became questioned. We see this in Malachi chapter 1, verses 2 and following. Malachi was decrying the priesthood because they were not doing their job well enough. And after Zerubbabel, and no one knows exactly what happened to him, but he disappeared, perhaps into Egypt. He may have run away, but there were no more Davidic kings. The lineage at this point was lost. The loss of a Davidic king, the loss of hopes in the Davidic covenant, the loss of prophecy, because there was no king to challenge, and that's what the prophets lived for, to challenge the king. They had no credible message. This led to many things, including the rise of apocalyptic prophecy. There are portions of Malachi's book that are very apocalyptic. And it also led to the priests taking on more power and leadership. Aaron's priestly line began to rise, and the Persians supported the priest's rule. They thought it was safer, no military, and the hope for the Davidic line passed on to Levitical priests, the descendants of Aaron. And the priests, they were the ones that saved the culture of the covenant, and they were dominant in Jewish life into the 2nd century. I'd like to say a word quickly about a couple of books of wisdom literature that I mentioned just a moment ago. One was the book of Ruth. She was a Moabite woman who became King David's great-grandmother. And at the time that Ezra was preaching the evils of non-Jews, the book of Ruth shows the key and positive role that a foreign woman had played in Jewish history. The book of Jonah was set in the by showing the evil Ninevites, who were the Assyrians, and that these Ninevites, when they received the word of the Lord from Jonah, they responded and repented. Remember, the Assyrians were the ones who had conquered the 10 northern tribes way back in the 8th century BC. If Jonah had not preached to the Ninevites, then Assyria would have been destroyed, and Israel would not have been conquered and destroyed, and probably Judah would not have been destroyed later. At least this was the thinking. So anyway, those books came from this time and were very important. The world of the Jews caved in following their return from Babylonian exile. The demise of prophecy and monarchy, the influence of Persian and later Greek thought, efforts to live well in a foreign land. Under the Persian Empire, which they were from about 538 to 333 BC, following that, Alexander the Great came in 333 and conquered, but then he died, and his descendants, the Ptolemies particularly, ruled until about 200 BC. And the Jewish area, Palestine, was under Syrian control from 200 to 168 BC. And that was a series of kings, all with the name Antiochus. After Alexander's death, I'm going to unpack that a little bit, the Jewish people were under Ptolemy, and they included the area of Egypt. Then way back in about 198 BC, the Syrians, the Seleucids, took Judah from the Ptolemies. Antiochus IV, who was named Epiphanes, was the ruler. And there was a movement in Jerusalem to assimilate into Greek life. And so the Syrian rulers did many harsh things. They passed laws to outlaw kosher food and the Sabbath observance. Circumcision was outlawed. A circumcised infant was killed and literally hung around its mother's neck. And then soon the abomination that makes desolation that we read about in apocalyptic writing, a pig that was offered on the altar in the Holy of Holies, the statue of Zeus in the Holy of Holies, prompted the Maccabean revolt. And the Maccabees defeated the Syrians, and this family, because Maccabees was not really the family name, that was a title meaning the lion. Judas Maccabeus was Judas the lion. The family name were the Hasmoneans, and they took charge, and they were a priestly group, and they ruled as a religious government until about 64 BC. and then the Romans showed up and conquered. There were a lot of books of wisdom literature that were written during this time: Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes, stories about living well, living triumphantly in foreign courts, the first 6 chapters of Daniel, the book of Esther. And the people began to turn to apocalyptic literature and theology. Apocalyptic literally means an uncovering or a revelation. They taught how to cope with loss, provided moral values and answers, answering that famous question, why do bad things happen? And how to deal with universal questions concerned with earlier times and also the end time. And the message in all this, in the apocalyptic writing, was that you could return originally to that state of grace represented by the Garden of Eden. Apocalyptic literature was highly symbolic, but the symbols were never explained. This genre was geared for insiders, for people who knew basically what the symbols meant, but it left a lot of room for speculation. It really is a fairly pessimistic view of history, saying that only God could rectify things, a belief that God has everything under control, but things would go from bad to worse, that there would be redemption and vindication in the end, at the end of time. It enabled people to survive living in essentially hopeless situations. There was a development in this time of the idea of Satan, Lucifer, as a demonic character, roughly equivalent to God, but the opposite. This was this idea of cosmic dualism came from Zoroastrianism, which was from Persia. The image of the sons of light versus the sons of darkness. The Greeks had a belief in the influence of bad gods. All of this deepened the understanding of the satanic image, that there would be cosmic wars between angels and demons. Apocalyptic literature was written late, but it was backdated. Daniel, for example, was written about 168, around the time of the Maccabean rebellion, but it was set back in the 500s under Babylonian and then Persian rule. It was prompted by this horrible suffering under Antiochus IV. Remember, eschatological apocalypse, wonderful, easy to say, right? Represented vindication at the end of time. Not to predict the end, but to give people hope in the midst of tribulation, that God will vindicate faithful people, giving them a reason to hang on. Apocalyptic thought was prompted by Persian Zoroastrian dualism, Greek speculation about heaven and hell, and faith that God still has a plan. The anticipation was of a messianic figure who would bring about the end of time. The eschaton was rampant in the centuries before Jesus and was directed to and spoke to people undergoing great suffering. People always tried to speculate when the end would come. And there were attempts, and still are, to reinterpret symbols from the past as signs of the future. Remember, apocalyptic prophecy always spoke to its own age. Okay, I know there's a lot to listen to, but I'd like to focus in just a little bit on the book of Daniel, and specifically the apocalypse of Daniel. The first 6 chapters of the book of Daniel have familiar stories at Nebuchadnezzar's court, the Babylonian court. Daniel tells and interprets the king's dreams, a symbolic statue. Remember those stories? The story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in a fiery furnace. How Daniel interprets the king's second dream, a great tree that's cut down to a stump, the king turned into a wild beast for a time, and then the story of King Belshazzar's feast, the famous handwriting on the wall, and that very night the Persians conquered the Babylonians. And then finally, under King Darius, the Persian and Mede, Daniel and the lion's den. Wonderful stories that are not really so much for children. And then following are the apocalyptic visions of Daniel. The vision of 4 beasts, a lion with eagle's wings, which represented Babylon, a bear with 3 ribs in its mouth, the Medes, the 4-headed and 4-winged leopard, which was the Persians, and the 10-horned beast, with iron teeth, representing the Seleucid kings, the Syrians, with the little horn representing Antiochus Epiphanes. And there's also the image of the Ancient of Days, one like a son of man, who was a heavenly being, not just a person. He was divine and he was eschatological, a messianic king representing the inbreaking of this new kingdom. The Son of Man is divine and yet in human form, a younger divinity than the Ancient of Days, enthroned on high and given power and dominion, sovereignty on the earth. Sounds a little bit like Jesus, doesn't it? This was written a couple of centuries before Jesus. Then there was the vision of the two-horned ram, which represented the Persian Median Empire that was running rampant until a male goat defeats it despite breaking its horn. Again, the little horn is Antiochus Epiphanes, who persecuted the Jews in Jerusalem from 168 to 165. The angel Gabriel interprets that God will destroy the Greeks and the Syrians and end their dominance. Then there was a vision of 70 years for exile. Daniel's prayer for his people. Gabriel comes again, announces 70 weeks to atone for their sins and to re-sanctify the temple, and that God will pour desolation upon the desolator, Antiochus IV. It reveals the future, that there were 3 more Persian kings to follow Cyrus. That would be Darius, Xerxes, and Artaxerxes, who would then be defeated by Alexander the Great. And then after his death, 2 strong kings, Ptolemy in Egypt and Seleucus in Syria, Mesopotamia. Now, of course, all these events had already happened when the book of Daniel was written, so they were presented as prophecies of the future, but they were remembrances and history. Bernice, the daughter of Ptolemy, married Antiochus II. They were all assassinated. Ptolemy III invaded Syria for revenge. He defeated Seleucid II, got a lot of money out of that. Ptolemy IV defeated Antiochus III, but failed to follow up. Antiochus III then took over Palestine from Ptolemy V, and finally Antiochus gave his daughter to marry Ptolemy V. And all the historic intrigue and activity was told as future prediction. And Antiochus Epiphanes took out his frustration on Jerusalem, abolishing worship, setting up the abomination that makes desolation, setting himself up as divine, all of which prompted the Maccabean rebellion. After all that, I want to take just a few minutes to look at the beginning again of the Revelation of John. Remember, the Revelation of John was not an original title. It did not have a title on it. An apocalypse means a revelation and uncovering. And Revelation, what we call the Revelation, is the most familiar of many Christian apocalypses, and it's the only one in the Bible. All the apocalyptic writing set forth an apocalyptic worldview in narrative form. The understanding that this worldview comes from studying the context, the history in which it was written. It's based on the perceived failure of prophecy, not the failure of God. Apocalypses were usually written anonymously. There are lots of seemingly bizarre images. We see this in Revelation, and they're interpreted by a heavenly angel. The imagery is not to be interpreted literally. They're symbolic statements about the present trouble and what would happen in the near future. This is what Revelation says about itself, and that there is a triumphant ending. God will ultimately prevail, and encourages believers to hold on and keep the faith. So, we talked a little bit last time about the first chapter of Revelation, and I'm just going to, if you'd like to stop and reread that second and third chapters, the letters to the 7 churches, you may do that. I'm just going to go through them right now and tell you a little bit about each letter. The 7 churches in Asia. The first to the angel of the church in Ephesus from Jesus. Starts out with some positive things. Jesus was a very shrewd person. Your work, your toil, your patient endurance. I know you cannot tolerate evildoers. You're able to discern true and false apostles. You endure patiently, and you bear up for the sake of my name, Jesus said. But there are some problems. You have abandoned the love and the faith that you had at first. You need to repent. You need to do the works you did when you first started. If not, I will come to you and remove your lampstand, remember your church, from its place. But then there's some more positive. To your credit, you hate the works of the Nicolaitans, the same, the ones that John hates. The Nicolaitans were a heretical group in the 1st and 2nd century, and it's possible that they were practicing all sorts of freedom like gluttony and all that stuff. But then finally Jesus said, to everyone who conquers, I will give permission to eat from the tree of life in the paradise of God as you return to Eden. To the angel of the church in Smyrna, the 2nd letter, I know your affliction, your poverty, even though you're rich. Smyrna was a church of some importance because it existed in the center of the emperor cult. And that was such a big deal back then. The message was to the Christians, don't be afraid. There will be persecution coming, but don't fear. And the apocalyptic message, be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. Let anyone who has an ear listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. Whoever conquers will not be harmed by the second death. And that's a couple of those letters. I think we'll pick up the rest of them next time.